Germany's kind of a big deal, right? Sort of the unofficial point person of the EU. Biggest economy in Europe by a substantial margin. I didn't even realize how much of a heavyweight they were until I started fact-checking for this video. Not to mention it was at the center of 2 world wars. The weird thing is, unlike England and France, which have been around for, 1,000 years, Germany is younger than the United States. For most of history, Germany didn't exist. There were Germans, but no Germany. The closest thing was the Holy Roman Empire, which, if we're talking about maybe the Ottonians, it was sort of synonymous with a great big, mostly German kingdom, but it got looser and looser as it went on, and by the beginning of the 1800s, the map of Europe looked like this. Northern Europe looks almost identical to today. Western Europe as well, if you ignore France getting a little glommy with the Low Countries and Italy. Oh, this is a little spicy. The Ottomans are still in the Balkans, and Austria's got a big old empire, and then, oh my god, what happened here? Someone made scrambled eggs out of Germany. That was the Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 tiny independent states loosely united under the emperor, but look at these two. Prussia and Austria were both doing the hokey pokey with 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and despite being part of the same empire, they spent the last 60 years as each other's arch nemeses. So when Napoleon came along in 1806 and broke apart the Holy Roman Empire, even though Napoleon eventually lost, no one really cared enough to put it back together, not even the emperor himself. But Napoleon did lose, and so what we're left with in 1815 is the German Confederation, which was kind of like the Holy Roman Empire, except even weaker. The question was, who was really going to be in charge of the Germans? Austria was an ancient power with a network of alliances stretching the continent, but Prussia was the up-and-coming great power with one of the most effective militaries in the world, thanks in part to the efforts of one sporting young man in a dapper jacket and a penchant for war who decided to keep living long enough to become one of the most influential men of his century. But the man who invented Germany, Frederick the Great's spiritual successor of sorts, wasn't an ambitious king who made up his mind to conquer everything, or a forward-thinking revolutionary who found a way to make everybody get along. He was a conservative politician who originally wanted nothing to do with it. Thanks to Kingdom Maker for sponsoring this video. Alas! Oh, boo-hoo! Boo-hoo-hoo-hoo! What's the matter, Bismarck, old chum? I was born in the wrong generation, Gottfried. I yearn for the good old medieval days. But you're a politician, not a king. Your job didn't exist back then. Yes, those were the days. Now I can only take solace in old books and Kingdom Maker, my favorite free-to-play app on iOS and Android. Whatever became of the good old days when royalty could battle, boink, and betray their way to glory. Boink? Oh yes, any old fool can send young men to die on the battlefield. It takes a real strategist to make love and war. Back when you could breed noblemen and send them dungeon crawling for fat loot, and sacrifice the ones you didn't like into a volcano. Alas, these days the only place one can find a combination of grand real-time strategy, RPG, and sim gameplay in a charming, charismatic package is in the hours of unfolding content of Kingdom Maker, available for free in the link below. Bismarck's story begins in 1848, which is probably one of the biggest single years in European history. Not because of any singular event, but because of a lot of little events, and some kinda big events. All around Europe, the middle and working classes were kinda like, hey, it's 1848, we've got steam engines and junk, what's all this feudalism still doing here? And so there's all these revolutions everywhere where people are rising up for democracy and freedom of the press and an end to serfdom and workers' rights. And Bismarck is sort of this little brown-nosed kid who is actually 33, living in his private country estate trying to rally his peasants, declaring, "You don't want democracy anyway. Come, let's rise up against the tyranny of the working class. Let's go to Berlin and quash those naughty rabble-rousers in the name of the king." The liberal movement in 1848 kind of runs out of steam because they got a few concessions from the king, which ultimately amounted to a limited constitution and a three-estate-style parliament where 80% of the population got 1/3 of the vote because they watched my video on Louis XVI and saw how well that idea worked for France. And also, they fell really short because they wanted to create a united Germany, and it turns out that's really hard, actually. But that meant when Bismarck got elected to parliament, he got a bunch of brownie points for siding with the king, which was a great start to his political career. Then the king died and got replaced by a liberaler king who sidelined Bismarck for a few years, but then he died and a conservative-er king came to power. The conservative-er king Wilhelm I got into a shouting match with Parliament over the annual budget. Basically, he wanted more money going into the army, and he wanted to keep the service length at 3 years instead of 2. And he thought to himself, if only I had a conservative ally in Parliament that I could give a boatload of political power to in order to push through my agenda. Oh wait! So Bismarck becomes prime minister and walks into Parliament like, so if you don't approve a budget this year, we're gonna be forced to keep using the old one, which also means 3-year service. So give us a better budget! Oh no, this is the budget. You can take it or leave it. Give me this stupid budget. How was that? Legally dubious, but very clever. I don't know how I can ever thank you enough. Complete control over foreign policy for the next 30 years. What? Luckily for the king, Bismarck was still a devout monarchist and wasn't about to pull a coup or anything. He mostly just got his way by being the best at his job and threatening to quit if the king didn't do things his way. Now at this point, he had actually warmed up to the idea of German unification as long as Prussia got to be more important than Austria. Within his first year in office, he quite famously gave a speech saying that words failed to unite Germany in 1848. Now he would unite Germany with blood and iron. He teamed up with a guy named Rohn, who reorganized the army, and a guy named Moltke, the military strategist who thought real good about how to kill people. With their powers combined, Bismarck wanted to take advantage of the fact that the traditional alliances that held Europe together since the defeat of Napoleon were a little shaky ever since the Crimean War. But instead of pulling a Napoleon going, "This is the way the world is gonna be, you got a problem with that? Come at me, bro!" Bismarck was going to be very careful in picking his fights. He began with a simple succession dispute in Denmark over who should inherit the duchies bordering what would eventually become Germany. Nothing wrong with that, right? Look, even Austria is helping him. Bismarck wins the war for one side, but makes a bunch of impossible demands and takes over the land for Prussia. But oh look, they're sharing it with Austria. Look at them, isn't that cute? Prussia's such a good friend. But oh no, Austria's land is farther away from their empire, and they have to cross through Prussia to get it, and oh geez, things are getting real tense. Who could have predicted this? Well, Austria got real mad and broke their promise, so now poor Prussia has to declare war because they're the ones being swindled. Surely the rest of Europe can understand. Now you might be wondering, what does a war with Austria over land in Denmark have to do with German unification? Good question. Remember the German Confederation? Although the little German states were split between who supported Prussia and who supported Austria, officially the German Confederation was supposed to all declare war on Prussia. So Bismarck said, "Bugger that, you're not allowed to attack me. In fact, you're not allowed to exist anymore." 7 weeks later, Prussia won the war, the Confederation was gone, and replaced by the North German Confederation. The states that allied with Prussia were technically independent, while the states that fought against Prussia all got annexed. And then there was Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, who stayed neutral and are still out there vibing to this day. So now we've got kinda sorta Germany. Big mega block of German states all smooshed together and controlled by Prussia. But it looks like this, and the Germany you've probably seen in World War I looks like this. And it would only take one more war. This time, Bismarck would take over Germany by attacking France. Or technically, by getting France to attack him. It went like this. King Wilhelm is going for his morning stroll before visiting the spa, and a French diplomat walks up to him. He says, "Pardon me, your majesty, but as you know, a distant cousin of yours was briefly considered for the throne of Spain. He's since renounced any claim, but the foreign minister would like your assurance that you won't be supporting any members of your house for the Spanish crown." "I beg your pardon, sir. Of course I'm sympathetic to his concerns, but I'm afraid I'm not in a position to bind myself to a particular course of action for the indefinite future. You must understand." "Of course. I'll bring him your answer." Now, it was Bismarck's job to inform the press of what went on that day, and the way he told it was more like this. "Alors, you hobgoblin, listen up! We get to say what happens in Spain, and if you don't like it, you can eat my pants! Back off before we flatten your silly little country into the stinky German dirt! Pack my lunch, you slug-guzzling stocking sniffer! So all the French were mad at the Germans, and all the Germans were mad at the French. Then, when Bismarck and friends kicked the French's butts, the German states in the South all said, "Wow, you're so cool! I wish we were part of Germany!" And they all hopped on board, and the North German Confederation became the Empire of Germany, and King Wilhelm became Emperor Wilhelm, or Kaiser Wilhelm I. And just to add insult to injury, they named him emperor in Versailles just a few months after the French emperor lost his title. Now all that was left was to turn Germany into a major player. I mean, Prussia was already a great power, but a majorer player. He tried to get German Catholics to stop voting by arresting all of their bishops. That went about as well as you'd expect. He tried to Germanize the non-Germans living in his empire, and there's a whole debate to be had over the pros and cons of nationalism and the idea of the nation-state. He cracked down on socialism while at the same time creating the first modern welfare state, an achievement which I am entirely downplaying in the interest of time because foreign policy is Bismarck's bread and butter. Bismarck was exceptional at eyeing when other states were weak and ready to be taken advantage of, and still convincing them into being the ones to declare war on him, but he was just as good at determining when another state's best interests were in line with his, and avoiding war. It feels very prophetic that when a crisis in the Balkans emerged in 1885, Bismarck had the foresight to warn about, quote, plunging Europe from Moscow to the Pyrenees and from the North Sea to Palermo into a war whose issue no man can foresee. At the end of the conflict, we should scarcely know why we had fought. And remember that time Europe got together and decided to carve up Africa? That was Bismarck's doing when he all of a sudden decided that colonies weren't a waste of money anymore. There was just one thing Bismarck hadn't counted on. King Wilhelm I died in 1888, and his successor, Frederick III, was 16 years younger than Bismarck, and Bismarck was already a 73-year-old man, so he would be working with this new king for the rest of his life. Nope, the king died in 99 days. And his successor, one Kaiser Wilhelm II, shared Bismarck's passion for participating in government, but not his aptitude. The two fought frequently, and Bismarck was politely asked to resign, while Wilhelm II led the empire towards World War I. With nothing else to do in his old age, Bismarck wrote memoirs with the primary objective of dissing the emperor, and then died.